In our last lecture, we looked at reasons for the regime's legitimacy and accountability. We offered complementary theories explaining the regime's resiliency. In this lecture, we look at ideological development and performance. Paying attention to seemingly academic debates in China is important because absent regularized channels for the expression of public opinion, Chinese intellectuals have traditionally and continue to play an important role in articulating diverse social interests. Historically, these debates have also served as a window into the opaque world of China's elite politics, as individual intellectuals and the arguments they champion have often served as proxies for the ideological divisions and policy differences amongst China's top leaders. Such lively debates have accompanied the course of China's reform and opening up since it was inaugurated in 1978 and traditionally intensified in the run-up to the convocation of the Chinese Communist Party's National Congress held every 5 years. The eventual winners and losers in these debates become apparent when the policies adopted at the Congress, which acts as a guide for China's development for the ensuing 5 years, are made public. For example, following the period of economic and political retrenchment in the wake of Tiananmen, the 14-party Congress held in 1992 signaled that reformers led by Deng Xiaoping had prevailed over conservatives. After a bitter proxy debate that had raged among intellectuals over what is socialist and what is capitalist, the Congress endorsed the creation of a socialist market economic system, heralding a new era of rapid market reform. However, once the party's political and economic line has been set at the Congress, it traditionally ends and signals the end of this debate. Those who continue to overstep this line face rebuke from the party, or worse. Following the 14-party Congress, for example, conservative leaders lost their positions on the all-powerful Politburo Standing Committee. These intellectual debates, therefore, are not confined to the ivory tower of academia in China. They remain an important channel for the articulation of diverse interests and for mediation between state and society. They are also one pillar of the policy-making process. A number of leading intellectuals serve as advisors to China's leaders, and their imprint of their ideas is often clearly discernible in government policies. Put differently, since Deng Xiaoping began to undercut Mao Zedong's revolution in the late 1978, halting and restoring political reforms has been a hallmark in the contemporary era. Balancing between too much and too little political and economic reforms has kept China relatively stable. It has also left the nation in a state of extreme contradiction. The market economy is straining against a political structure with foundations that has elements from Stalin's Russia. The intellectual debate regarding this is thus paramount to understand. It is difficult to predict where China is going in the 2020s. It is becoming more and more difficult, however, to imagine that it can continue to transform itself into a more stable, cosmopolitan, and global nation without a clear sense of its ultimate political destination. Whether the PRC will be able to continue straddling the widening divide between its economic system and its anachronistic sort of political system is a salient question, especially if the current boom turns to a bust. Another question we need to ask ourselves is what process will China use to decide how it should advance and what it should become? Where should contemporary Chinese intellectuals, politicians, and leaders turn for ideas and potential models? What we're going to argue in this lecture is that China is able to look into its own past for ideas, if not answers. It is important to remember that China's modern political history did not begin with the victory of communism in 1949. In fact, in the first decades of the 20th century, when after the fall of the last imperial dynasty in 1911, the Chinese last found themselves searching for a new political beginning. China was a fermentation vat of free thinking, political inquiry, open discussion, self-criticism, research, and writing. Then as now, China found itself in a period of profound transition. The national conversation that began in the final years of the Qing dynasty during the 1890s and lasted until the Japanese occupation in the early 1930s has clear relevance for the challenges of China's current need for political self-reinvention. This Chinese Enlightenment was started by the likes of Kang Youwei, Yan Fu, and Liang Qichao, three classically trained scholars. In searching for ways to reform their nation's imperial system of education and governance to bring back China's fuqiang, or wealth and power, they turned outward, breaking with Confucianism's tradition of insularity. They became the first generation in China to embrace foreign ideas and institutions, including the notions of constitutional monarchy, republicanism, and democracy, which were considered every bit as unorthodox and heretical by the imperial establishment as they are by the Communist Party today. In the face of new ideas challenging Confucian traditionalism and accompanying calls for reform and revolution, the Qing dynasty fell, plunging China into a period of chaotic change. Intellectuals began to search urgently for new cultural and political answers, creating an environment charged with inquiry and intellectual vigor. Listening to some of these century-old voices, it becomes clear not only that China has a legacy of vibrant discussion that focused on reinventing its system of governance, but also that many of the leaders and thinkers who led those discussions were of towering intellect and sophistication, which are all enormously relevant to today's China. In criticizing the emperor's unilateral power at the end of the Qing dynasty, reformer Kang Youwei called for complete reform. He was one of the first Chinese thinkers of consequence to declare that change was the most basic and dynamic force in history. But moreover, China would perish if it did not find a way to break the embrace of traditional thinking that clung to the past as the only model for the future. Kang's call for a new kind of polity was radically different than anything China had heard beforehand. Similarly, Liang, a classic scholar who had become interested in foreign ideas while traveling in Japan and the United States, soon became convinced that the Chinese government's relationship to its citizenry was in need of radical reformulation. As this intellectual ferment grew, what we found was that Liang's ideas became quite salient during the May 4th movement, the 1919 populist movement that is, which favored science and democracy. Liang and his activist colleagues welcomed this change. In trying to formulate the proper relationship between China's incipient new press and a new form of government, Liang hoped that the beginning of the 20th century would prove a time when as many doctrines of the world as possible would be freely brought into China as a way of jolting itself into modernity. In his 1899 introduction on the Notes on Freedom, Liang quoted John Stuart Mill. In the progress of mankind, there is nothing more important than freedom of thought, speech, and of the press. It was through free speech, an idea that was just being introduced to China, that Liang hoped to educate a new citizenry for China's new republican future. Like Kang and many other classical scholars who became enamored of reform, Liang was also deeply fearful of abandoning the entire corpus of traditional thought, culture, and political institutions. What distinguished these pre-Marxist Chinese intellectuals was their interest in combining foreign ideas with Chinese elements to develop a new synthesis. At core, they were pragmatists, not idealists. Although they were drawn to the French philosophers and the experiment launched by the American founders, they also read the English and Scottish utilitarians. Liang and his counterparts struggled to synthesize these strands. The imperatives of individualism, freedom, and democracy, and the need for a strong state that could restore Chinese unity and pride. As post-imperial China disintegrated, Liang focused much of his thought on how to create a new kind of effective government power without hubbling it with too much democracy. Ultimately, in his brand of syncretic liberalism, societal and state interests almost ended up triumphing those of the individual. Liang's intellectual framework, especially as it developed in his later years, came to form something of a template for liberal political thought in China. In fact, one of those influenced by Liang's thinking was the Cantonese medical doctor Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was a nationalist dedicated to curing China's humiliation by forming a new government that was both strong and essentially republican. Although Sun lived abroad for many of his formative years, his ideas for remaking China came to play an important role in the debate about how China would be governed without an emperor. Sun was an advocate of outright revolution against the Qing dynasty, rather than piecemeal reform leading towards a constitutional monarchy. He envisioned Chinese republicanism developing in three progressive stages by a process in which he called guided democracy, which he spelled out in his classic treatise, The Three Principles of the People. Although Sun believed that China's salvation would come from greater democracy, it was the liberty of the nation, not individual liberty, that he most ardently sought. Like Liang, he was hardly an advocate for unrestrained individual rights. He wanted a process that would lead to a strong China, one that can defend itself and stand up to the predatory powers that sought to dismember it. He was a Democrat, and he actually went on to become president of the short-lived Chinese Republic. But democracy for him was a tool for helping China cast off the bonds of foreign imperialism, not a goal in itself. Deng Xiaoping and his appointed successors regarded intellectuals as essential to achieve their goal of economic modernization and make China once again rich and powerful. Those intellectuals involved in the sciences, technology, and economics, in particular, enjoyed elite status as advisors to the government, similar to that which intellectuals had enjoyed throughout most of Chinese history until the 1949 revolution. Beginning in the late 1970s, Deng and his then purported successor, Yu Yaobang, rehabilitated virtually all of the intellectuals purged by Mao Zedong and released them from prisons, labor reform camps, into which Mao had sent them. Intellectuals were appointed to high-level positions in government, academia, and the media. Deng and his allies repudiated the ideology and programs of the Mao era that had politicized intellectual activity. Since China's opening to the outside world and the move to the market in the last few decades in the 20th century, intellectuals worked in an increasingly pluralistic cultural and intellectual environment, comparable to which existed in the early decades of the 20th century. Nevertheless, an influential but small number of intellectuals on either side of the political spectrum, liberal and leftists, expressed increasingly dissident views as China's economic reforms took off. On the liberal side, intellectuals associated with Reformist Party leaders found themselves by the late 1980s in conflict with the political establishment they had joined and advised. As former Marxist theorists, editors, and writers, they sought to fill the void left by the bankruptcy of Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought as a result of the Cultural Revolution. They first turned to this humanistic version of Marxism, similar to that of Eastern Europe at the time, in which they dispensed with much of the Leninism that had reminded the abiding belief of leadership. By the mid-1980s, they became more acquainted with Western democratic ideas. They began to prosper democratic reforms. In the late 1986, proposal for political reform culminated in student demonstrations for political rights. In the late 1980s, a new school of thought emerged called Neo-Authoritarianism, formulated by a younger group of more technocratic intellectuals who were associated with Deng Xiaoping's next appointed successor, Zhao Ziyang. As advisors on economic policies, they were attracted to the authoritarian political model of the ethnic and post-Confucian East Asian neighbors, the Four Little Dragons. They called for several decades of economic reform under a strong centralized leader until a large educated middle class emerged that can lead the country towards greater political reform. Despite their neo-authoritarian viewpoints, they supported the demonstrators in Tiananmen in spring 1989, who demanded for political reform and greater freedoms of speech. When Deng Xiaoping purged Zhao for refusing to support the imposition of martial law on May 20, 1989, and ordered the troops to disperse the demonstrators in June 4, 1989, these highly placed intellectuals were imprisoned, sent to labor reform camps, exiled abroad, or purged from the establishment. Thus, those on the liberal side of the political spectrum were silent in the aftermath of June 4th, 1989. They and the student leaders were imprisoned for relatively short periods of time, whereas the workers who had joined the 1989 demonstrations received stiffer sentences. Although initially there was a return of Maoists to the propaganda department and the media, and a revival of the politicalization of academia as in the Mao era, it was also relatively brief in the early 1990s. Moreover, unlike the Mao period, the intellectuals as a class, their families and colleagues, did not suffer for the supposed crimes of their associates. Therefore, while disillusioned with the regime, most intellectuals and students were not alienated from it. Most continued to work in the party state, bureaucracies, academia, and the media. Those thrown out or unable to gain a position in the official establishment turned to business. The creation of a market economy and the opening to the outside world offer alternatives to government employment, especially non-state enterprises, foreign joint ventures, or private businesses. Unlike the bureaucracy or academia, where they might lose their jobs or salaries for expressing dissenting views, these alternative venues provided a degree of economic independence that offered some protection from political retaliation. China's growing economic and technological international interdependence made it virtually impossible to keep out influences from abroad. Furthermore, the political leadership was reluctant to back up these campaigns with threats of violence, mass mobilization, and ideological zeal that had been so destabilizing during the Mao period. In the mid-1990s, a new, younger generation of intellectuals who came of age in the post-Mao era, some of whom were close to the princelings, children of the party elders, moved to another extreme. Like the neo-authoritarians of the late 1980s, they did not refer to Marxist-Leninism, but unlike them, they did not endorse a full-scale move to the market and the development of a middle class that would eventually lead China towards greater political reforms. Rather, some of their neoconservative views overlap with those of the neo-Marxists in that they decried the decentralization that accompanied China's move to the market and urged a retightening of centralized controls over the region and over cultural life. They were particularly upset about the destabilizing impact of millions of migrants into the cities in the 1990s who came in search of economic opportunities and called for their return to the villages. Whereas the neo-Maoists had argued for reassertion of a centralized economy in ideological terms, the neoconservatives argued for it in practical terms. A strong central state was necessary to ensure stability and continuing tax revenues. Without a re-strengthening of party-state controls, they asserted, the party would be unable to handle the social instabilities caused by the growing economic regionalism and internal migrants unleashed by economic reforms. Unless the erosion of the party-state's authority was stopped, they warned that chaos, the traditional Chinese nightmare, would result. They implicitly criticized Deng Xiaoping's reforms for weakening the central government. Another important intellectual current during the mid-1990s to early 2000s was a revival of Neoconfusionism. Again, although its proponents did not refer to Marxist-Leninism, the Zhang's leadership found their views more in tune with its goals than the views of either the neo-Maoists or the liberals. The Neo-Confucianists asserted that modernization need not necessarily mean westernization. In fact, the seeds of modernization, they argue, could be found in Chinese history and values, specifically in Confucianism. Instead of China's deeply embedded traditional culture being an obstacle to its modernization, as preached by the May 4th intellectuals and party reformers in the 1980s, they insisted that Confucianism was conducive to modernization. Citing the dynamic economies of post-Confucian shaped societies of their East Asian neighbors, they asserted that a revived Neo-Confucianism, with its emphasis on the group, authority, and education, could provide the intellectual and cultural underpinnings for China's rapid economic development, while helping it avoid the sort of perceived immorality and individualism of Western capitalism. Counter to China's growing involvement with the outside world and growing internal regionalism due to the move to the market, the post-June 4th leaders and intellectual spokespeople not only re-emphasize ideological unity, but also re-energize the spirit of nationalism, as leaders early in the 20th century had done to promote political unity. Generally, the younger generation of intellectuals and urban youth readily embraced the leadership's reinvigorated nationalism. Dipping back into the intellectual ferment that marked the first half of the 20th century, and comparing it to the stilled public dialogue today, it is easy to feel wistful for a time in China where debate was common, where ideas and discussions mattered, and thinkers were open to the world and able to speak freely. As thinkers absorb foreign ideas of every kind and try to graft them onto China's own past traditions, they wrestle with almost every political question imaginable, especially how to reformulate the relationship of citizen to state. As China grapples to find alternatives to the PRC's Marxist-Leninist Maoist legacy, intellectuals and political leaders should be encouraged to remember that China has another legacy to draw upon. There's a cadre of founding father-like intellectuals who envision a path to openness and articulated it within their native language. Their forgotten speeches and writings lie in Chinese libraries and archives, awaiting rediscovery. China can also rely on its diversifying intellectual sources. There are a plethora of academics attached to official and semi-official think tanks and party-state organizations. China's expanded education system and the commercialization of culture has opened up opportunities for non-establishment intellectuals working outside the system to take part in the discussion. The privatization of China's media and the expansion of the internet provides a plethora of newspapers, journals, and online sources willing to publish a wide range of views. The current debate also goes beyond the traditional reformers versus conservatives appellation and reflects the pluralization of opinion and interest that has taken place in China. The intellectual discourse also illustrates how characterizations of China as having a monolithic, top-down policy-making process fails to account for the divergence of views and pressures on Chinese leadership, and how the decision-making process is becoming increasingly complex and a reflection of aggregate social interests. In the absence of thinking about a new political system to accompany shifting Chinese citizens' expectations, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves in the near future and into the 2020s is that whether or not there's a crisis of legitimacy for the Communist Party at present. There are three considerations to factor in this regard. First, the compact the party has with its citizenry to improve their economic life may not compensate for a legitimacy deficit. Second, the party's revolutionary legacy is waning with the population, especially with the younger generation. And the third sort of consideration to factor is the fragility in the next leadership transition post-Xi Jinping. These are the salient questions that China will be grasping with as it continues to reform its political system to meet the expectations of the citizenry. This concludes our lecture on ideological development and performance. In our next lecture, we will turn our attention to marginalized groups.